Night today, Ozone Day is going on.
Ozone Day.
Okay, sorry for delay. I'm starting again now. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bhageshri Katre from IITM-ENVIS. Welcome to all our viewers, participants, and IITM staff for the celebration of World Ozone Day 2021. World Ozone Day is observed on September 16 every year to spread awareness among people about the depletion of ozone layer and find possible solutions to preserve it. This day offers an opportunity to focus global attention and action on this vital environmental issue. This year, the theme of Ozone Day is Montreal Protocol, keeping us our food and vaccines good. The Montreal Protocol started life as a global agreement to protect the ozone layer, a job it has done well, making it one of the most successful environmental agreements to date. Today, the hole in the ozone layer is healing, in turn, protecting human health, economies, and ecosystems. But as this year's World Ozone Day seeks to highlight, the Montreal Protocol does so much more, such as slowing climate change and helping to boost energy efficiency in the cooking sector, which contributes to food security. This year, we are observing World Ozone Day with Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav is an initiative of the Government of India to celebrate and commemorate 75 years of progressive India and the glorious history of its people, culture, and various achievements. Keeping this in mind, I would like to request Dr. Murthy, Scientist F and ENVIS Coordinator, to give a brief background of today's program and welcome our chief guest, Dr. Murthy.
Thank you, Bhageshri. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of ENVIS, Environmental Information System, which is a project of Ministry of Environment and Forest, I welcome you all, especially the chief guest of this function, Professor Oliver Weil, Lancaster University, UK, Director IITM, and all the participants who are watching this, and especially the students who have showed very good enthusiasm to participate in quiz competition as well as in the talk and to interact. So I welcome you all once again. So today is World Ozone Day. So ENVIS, Environment Information System, regularly celebrates various special. One of those days is World Environment Day. So IITM's theme given by Minister of Environment and Forest is air pollution and climate change. So on this occasion, I would like to tell that ozone, and everybody knows that it's helpful for humankind as it prevents ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface. But many people think that it's a good even if it is in the troposphere. So now our keynote speaker will address those issues and in detail regarding the harmful effects of ozone near the surface and how one can tackle to minimize pollution, which is a precursor for generation of ozone in the troposphere. So after the lead talk by Professor Oliver Weil, there will be a quiz competition for the students who have registered. So based on the talk, there will be some questionnaires and they can participate. Regarding the talk, if anybody has got any queries, they can pose their questions in chat box. Depending on the time constraint, we will answer that. Otherwise, you can send a mail for which they will get reply in due course. So now I request Bhageshri to give an introduction of our keynote speaker, Professor Oliver.
Yes, sir. Before I invite our chief guest, I would like to make some announcements for the quiz participants. First, I would like to thank all the registered participants for quiz. The registration is compulsory for the quiz competition. Those who have not registered yet can register now and even after the webinar. The quiz will be based on today's webinar and will get activated just after the talk. The viewers can ask their webinar related questions in the YouTube chat box, which will be conveyed to our chief guest. Wish you all the best. Moving towards today's guest lecture, I request Mr. Samir to play the video to introduce our chief guest. Activated just after the talk. The viewers can ask their webinar related questions in the YouTube chat box, which will be conveyed to our chief guest. Wish you all the best. Moving
We welcome today's keynote speaker, Professor Oliver White, Associate Director, Lancaster Environment Center, United Kingdom. He has completed his PhD in modeling tropospheric chemistry at the Department of Chemistry, University of Cambridge. His expertise is in development and application of numerical models to determine the impact and fate of atmospheric pollutants on local and global speaker. Dr. Oliver White, an atmospheric director, Lancaster Environment Center, and modeling tropospheric chemistry at the Department of Chemistry, University of Cambridge, and the Department of Chemistry, University of Cambridge. During his long scientific career, he received many honors, awards, and recognition to determine the impact and fate. Dr. Oliver is honored as Fellow of Royal Meteorological Society and was member of the Council in 2010 to 2013. He serves as a core panel member of the former editor of renowned scientific journals around the world. He was recognized as the Assistant Professor for Senior International Scientist, Chinese Academy of Sciences. He received the Precursor Award for Excellence in Research in year 2000. Professor Oliver White has more than 115 peer-reviewed publications in scientific literature. He is the former editor of renowned scientific journals around the world.
Sorry to interrupt. Actually, there is some technical problem. We'll run the video again.
Professor Oliver White has more than 115 peer-reviewed publications in scientific literature. He is the former editor of renowned scientific journals around the world.
Sorry to interrupt. Actually, there is some technical problem. We'll run the video again.
Professor Oliver White has more than 115 peer-reviewed publications in scientific literature. He is the former editor of renowned scientific journals around the world.
Sorry to interrupt. Actually, there is some technical problem. We'll run the video again.
We welcome today's keynote speaker, Professor Oliver White, Associate Director, Lancaster Environment Center, United Kingdom. He has completed his PhD in modeling tropospheric chemistry at the Department of Chemistry, University of Cambridge. His expertise is in development and application of numerical models to determine the impact and fate of atmospheric pollution on local, regional, and global scales. Dr. Oliver's interests are in atmospheric composition, chemistry and transport, and in understanding how natural and anthropogenic emissions of trace gases affect regional air quality and climate. During his long scientific career, he received many honors, awards, and recognition. To mention a few, Dr. Oliver is honored as Fellow of Royal Meteorological Society and was Member of Council in 2010 to 2013. He serves as a core panel member of NERC Peer Review College. He is a former editor of renowned scientific journals around the world. He is recognized as the visiting professor for Senior International Scientist, Chinese Academy of Sciences. He received a Frontier Award for Excellence in Research in year 2000. Professor Oliver White has more than 115 peer-reviewed publications in scientific literature, contributed to 4 book chapters. He is contributing author for major international ozone climate synthesis reports as well. IPCC Climate Assessment Report, IGAC Tropospheric Ozone Assessment Report, UNECE Scientific Assessment Report Towards Cleaner Air. With this short introduction, we welcome Professor Oliver White from Lancaster Environment Center to deliver World Ozone Day 2021 talk and have a dialogue with us.
Welcome, Professor Oliver. Now I request you to share your views on today's topic. Professor Oliver.
Thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. It's a great honour to have an opportunity to speak to you today about ozone in the troposphere and some of the studies that I've been doing over the years. So hopefully I can share screen now. What I'd like to do is give you an overview of tropospheric ozone, describe some of the challenges associated with it, and to think about what some of the potential threats are for India and how we might go about controlling ozone in future. So I thought I'd start off with a very brief introduction to ozone, to what it is and how it's formed. It's a natural product in the atmosphere. It's an allotrope of oxygen, triatomic oxygen. It's actually a colourless to pale blue gas in the atmosphere. We don't normally have enough of it there to see its colour, and it has quite a pungent smell, and that's what gives it its name, for ozone as Greek for smell. So it smells quite clean, and for a long time people thought that it was really quite healthy in the atmosphere for you. In fact, it's rather damaging, and we'll talk about that briefly in a short while. Ozone is also a strong oxidant in the atmosphere, so it can oxidize many other pollutants in the atmosphere, so it's important for atmospheric chemistry, from controlling some of the other processes going on in the atmosphere. So why is there ozone in the atmosphere? Well, it's just a natural consequence of oxygen being there. When we have oxygen up in the air, it can interact with light from the sun at very short wavelengths. At ultraviolet light, oxygen molecules can break apart to form oxygen atoms. Those oxygen atoms can recombine with the oxygen molecule to form ozone. So it's formed entirely naturally in the atmosphere, just as a consequence of having oxygen in the atmosphere and sunlight. And ultimately, ozone itself can also absorb light, ultraviolet light, and that will also cause it to break up and reform oxygen. So there's a set of 4 equations I have on the right-hand side there, which just summarize this process, the formation of ozone from oxygen in the atmosphere and its subsequent removal. This is called the Chapman mechanism, which was discovered in the 1930s and basically explains why there is naturally ozone in the atmosphere. This actually also explains where the ozone is in the atmosphere. It's formed by these processes which involve radiation and light from the sun, but it's also removed by very similar processes. And if we go very high in the atmosphere, up to the mesosphere, there's a lot of solar radiation, so ozone breaks down very quickly. So we don't have very much ozone in the mesosphere. If you come down to the lower atmosphere, to the troposphere, there's not very much sunlight radiation gets down here. So basically ozone doesn't form very quickly. So there's not very much ozone in the troposphere either. But in the stratosphere, halfway in between, we have a balance. Enough radiation to cause ozone, not enough to destroy it quickly. So basically, much of the ozone in the atmosphere is in the stratosphere. If we look at what the consequences are, on the right-hand side here, I'm showing you the solar spectrum. This is the spectrum of radiation, solar radiation, light and ultraviolet light coming down to the Earth. And I'm also showing you the absorption from different constituents in the atmosphere. So there's a lot of absorption at both ends of the spectrum, but there's not very much absorption in the visible part of the spectrum, and that's why we have light. The atmosphere is transparent to light. But ozone plays a very important role in these lower part region, where we have wavelengths something around 200 to 300 nanometers. So in the ultraviolet part of the spectrum, that's where ozone absorbs radiation, and that stops this ultraviolet radiation reaching the Earth. So ozone is very important for life on Earth because it filters out the ultraviolet light. It's a very important role to play. Those of you with sharp eyes will also see that ozone appears a number of other places along the spectrum here. It absorbs at slightly longer wavelengths too, and that actually stops heat radiating from the Earth. So actually ozone is a greenhouse gas as well. But it has an important role here. Most important role is in filtering out ultraviolet light so it doesn't reach the surface of the Earth. At longer wavelengths, it also absorbs, but instead of breaking up, that energy is often re-radiated as heat. So the energy absorbed by ozone in the atmosphere is also important for heating the atmosphere. So we have a heating effect in the stratosphere. And if you look on the left, you'll see the temperature profile up through the atmosphere. We might expect that temperature drops as you go up through the atmosphere, but you'll see that in the stratosphere, the temperature increases again before it drops off in the mesosphere. And this increase in temperature is just because of the ozone there, absorbing the sun's energy. So the actual temperature structure of the atmosphere is also because of ozone. So this is important because of the stability of the atmosphere. So that's why the weather that we experience just occurs down here in the troposphere, the lowest 10 or 15 kilometers of the atmosphere. So ozone is very important for both filtering out ultraviolet light and also for defining the dynamical behavior of the atmosphere, the temperature structure of the atmosphere. Now you see the ozone is mostly in the stratosphere, about 90% of it is there, and that's where it's very important for protecting us from ultraviolet light. But there's also some ozone lower in the atmosphere, down here in the troposphere. And I want to talk today about the ozone which is really down towards the surface of the Earth. And down here, ozone is a strong oxidant, so it's damaging to health and to vegetation. So this is a much less ozone down here, but it has a much greater effect on humans and our activities. And human activity has actually affected the ozone in a number of ways. Our emissions of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, led to stratospheric ozone depletion. This was recognised in the 1980s, and of course this is what the main focus of World Ozone Day is: the success of the Montreal Protocol at limiting the production and release of these CFCs into the atmosphere. And that, of course, allows the ozone layer to recover. So mankind has had a substantial effect on ozone in this particular layer, and it is now starting, fortunately, to recover. But mankind has also had an effect close to the surface, where emissions of nitrogen oxides and carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons, because of human activity, has led to an increase in ground level ozone. So that's really what I want to focus on today. Ozone lower in the atmosphere, in the troposphere. And I'll give you here 4 reasons why we care about this. First of all, ozone itself is a pollutant. It's a contributor to urban smog. So it's damaging for humans and for plants. Secondly, it's important for oxidation in the atmosphere. It controls much of the chemistry. It allows us to control the oxidation of methane and volatile organic compounds, VOC, natural and also human-released compounds in the atmosphere from the product of our everyday activities. Thirdly, ozone is important for climate. Ozone is a greenhouse gas. It's the 3rd most important greenhouse gas after carbon dioxide and methane. So it absorbs the heat radiated from the Earth and warms the planet. That's particularly important for ozone in the upper troposphere and lower stratosphere. But also, ozone has an indirect effect on climate because it governs the lifetime of many other greenhouse gases, in particular methane. So it indirectly can affect climate too. It makes it quite complicated to understand the role of ozone in climate. And the linking feature here is that there's a strong anthropogenic influence on ozone. The human impact on ozone is quite substantial, and it's increasing in the troposphere because of human activity. So basically, ozone has substantial environmental impacts at a variety of scale, from a local scale in the city or in rural areas, over regional scales, and also at global scales. And what we'd like to do is to be able to control it, to stop it increasing any more than it needs to. But this is actually quite challenging because ozone is what's called a secondary pollutant. It's actually formed in the atmosphere, in the troposphere, and it's difficult to control the variables which cause it. Its chemical production can be quite rapid, but it's also got a long enough lifetime that it can be transported around the globe. So we have to, most of the pollutants we focus on are really localized, but ozone is also a global scale pollutant as well as a local one. So finally, I want to finish up by thinking about how we can avoid its most damaging impacts. I'm a chemist by training, so let me give you a little bit of an introduction to why we have ozone in the troposphere. We talked about the processes going on in the stratosphere, the simple Chapman mechanism, but in the troposphere, ozone can also be formed by a slightly different process, and that's associated with nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere. And nitrogen oxides are released during combustion processes. So there's quite a lot of those around, particularly in more polluted regions. Nitrogen dioxide here can photolize, can break up under the effect of sunlight to form a nitric oxide, and also it can form an oxygen atom. That oxygen atom can combine with oxygen molecule to form ozone. So we have a natural source of ozone in the troposphere, not as big as the source in the stratosphere, but still quite substantial. And that can support about 10 parts per billion of ozone near the surface of the Earth. That means roughly 10 molecules of ozone for every billion molecules of air. That nitric oxide can react with ozone to reform nitrogen dioxide. So this forms a cycle, the catalytic cycle here, that forms some ozone, but also can destroy ozone as well. And the problem we have is that there's some competing reactions going on. NO can react with ozone, but it can also react with peroxy radicals, and that can reform nitrogen dioxide without destroying ozone. When this happens, then the cycling of nitrogen oxides leads to substantial ozone production. Where are these peroxy radicals from? Well, they're a natural consequence of oxidation processes in the atmosphere, where we have carbon monoxide or methane here, or other hydrocarbons or volatile organic compounds. They can oxidize to form these peroxy radicals. So wherever we have these processes going, we can have ozone formation. So it means that tropospheric ozone depends quite strongly on the concentrations of these different compounds: nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and volatile organic compounds. And all of these compounds are pollutants released into the air from human activities. So what does ozone look like at the surface of the Earth? So here's a little snapshot from one of my model simulations, looking at ozone at a particular time. This just happens to be the 1st of March in 2001. So it shows you the spatial variation of ozone around the globe. And the scale here runs from 0 in the blues up to about 80 parts per billion. So what you can see, there's more ozone in the northern hemisphere, and that's partly because there's greater emissions of precursors in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's partially also because of the time of year. We see the lowest levels of ozone in the tropical regions, equatorial regions, particularly the equatorial Pacific, and that's where we have a lot of water vapor around, which helps to reduce the ozone levels. So that's the cleanest part of the atmosphere from an ozone perspective. You can also see all kinds of features here. You can see highest ozone in this case over Tibet, and that's simply because it's higher in altitude, and this ozone is present in higher quantities as you go up through the atmosphere. You can also see a lot of meteorological features. You can see a pool of ozone out over the Atlantic. And this is an example of transport of ozone from North America over towards Europe. And equally, you can see a plume of ozone. In this case, it's behind a cold front sweeping out over the Pacific, away from East Asia. So, an example of transport processes going on in the atmosphere that can lead to ozone formed in one location being transported to a different location. You also see in this case there's quite a lot of destruction of ozone going on over parts of Asia here, and this is really because at this time this is night time. You know, fresh emissions going on in and destroying the ozone. When daytime comes, the ozone levels will rise again. So lots of features, lots of processes illustrated here that describe why it's quite a difficult thing to understand in the atmosphere and its variability. Why does it matter? Why are we looking at this? Well, here's an ozone scale at in the middle, from 0 at the bottom up to 120 parts per billion. The health standards for ozone are typically based on 8-hour averages. So basically daytime averages for ozone. And the European 8-hour standard, the air quality standard for ozone, is 60 parts per million. So most international standards are somewhere around the same level. In the US, the standard is slightly higher, about 70 parts per billion. The World Health Organization guideline is about 50 parts per billion. So somewhere in that region is where we're starting to see substantial damage caused by ozone. Of course, we also look at ozone in pollution episodes. So there's also a 1-hour standard, the European 1-hour standard here, about 100 to 120 parts per billion. And just so you can work out where you are, you can start to smell ozone when it gets to about 100 parts per billion. So when we're above 100, it's definitely very polluted conditions. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you surface measurements. These are the concentrations of ozone at the surface in different parts of the world between about 1850 all the way up to about 2000. So for the earliest measurements of ozone, we see concentrations around 10 parts per billion, but in recent years it's been climbing up to 40 or 50 parts per billion. And we're getting now very close to the levels where we know it causes some damage, very close to the standards. So only a small amount of additional ozone from our local sources is often required to push ozone beyond the air quality standards. And ozone in any particular place is quite sensitive to the global background. So basically, I want to emphasize that ozone really is a global pollutant. And we're getting to levels where it's starting to have a substantial effect. What effects does ozone have? Well, if you look on the left-hand side here, there's some studies from the health literature looking at the impact of ozone on human mortality. This is from some studies in the US about 15 years ago or so. As you increase ozone levels, you see an increase in the risk of premature mortality. These are very difficult numbers to extract, and very difficult to work these out. For the small quantities, up to about 20 ppb, we don't see very much impact. But once you get to higher levels of ozone, there starts to become a substantial impact on human health. A lot of uncertainty here, but clearly as a pollutant, it is damaging. It's damaging for health. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the impacts on vegetation. These are some studies looking at crop yields and the effect of ozone on reduction in the yields. And again, up to about 20 ppb, we don't see very much happening, but as ozone rises higher, we start to see substantial reductions in the productivity of the crops. Some crops are very sensitive, like winter wheat. Other crops are much less sensitive. But we can have substantial reductions in crop yields from the ozone. And of course, there's many impacts on natural vegetation as well. So if we look briefly at the impacts of ozone on human health, this is an example. This photograph is showing you Los Angeles in the US. And this is where ozone was really first recognized as a health problem in the 1930s and 1940s. There was an awful lot of traffic, everyone was driving, a lot of nitrogen oxides were being emitted, and this was leading to a lot of ozone production, which was again basically causing breathing difficulties and affecting visibility. We get ozone formed from the exhausts from the chemicals, nitrogen oxides, the hydrocarbons released by vehicles. What impact does it have on health? Well, say breathing difficulties is the biggest problem, technically called chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a number of respiratory problems, a number of respiratory diseases associated with ozone getting into the body and affecting lungs and affecting basically it stimulates a kind of variety of different responses in the body associated with oxidative damage. So it can basically make breathing more difficult, and it presents a substantial challenge to health. If we look at the health impacts of surface ozone on the global scale, the best assessments come from the global burden of disease. The latest assessment was that there are something like 365,000 premature mortalities each year. Roughly 1/3 of a million people each year are dying early because of the effects of ozone at the surface of the Earth. There's a lot of uncertainty associated with these assessments, and in fact, fairly recent medical studies have suggested that humans are actually more susceptible to ozone than we thought they were. So actually, some of the more recent numbers come out with higher mortalities. And there's a study here from Chris Malley suggesting that actually it might be as high as 1 million deaths each year, premature deaths caused by ozone at the surface. So it's a substantial effect on mortality. It's becoming one of the, it's certainly within the top 20 causes of human mortality. And interestingly, about both these studies, about 1/3 of this burden is born in India. So clearly, it's a substantial threat to Southern Asia and this part of the world. And if we look at some studies which are much more focused, particularly on India, there's a very nice study by Luc Conibert from the University of Leeds, who has assessed the health burdens in India from ozone, and he's calculated about 124,000 deaths per year using the lower estimate of the health impacts, and up to 374,000 deaths using the higher estimate. So we're saying somewhere roughly in the region of a 250,000 deaths per year. And to put that in context, the total deaths from air pollution are somewhat just over 1 million. So this is a reminder that the biggest cause of air pollution deaths, of course, is particles, particulate matter, aerosol particles in the atmosphere. They're the biggest, they're the number one concern. But ozone is behind that as number 2. And of course, for particles in the atmosphere, you can see them. You can see when it's dangerous. For ozone, it's much less clear when you're suffering from the consequences or not. And the figures below, again taken from Conibert's paper, show you again assessments from a wide number of different studies about the premature mortality in India, and you see there's a big variation between studies. There's a lot of uncertainty here. We still don't really fully understand the impacts of ozone on human health, but we know it is substantially damaging. So again, if there's any young scientists out there who are looking for scientific challenges associated with ozone, one of them is really getting a better understanding of the impacts of ozone on health. Try to get a better, more critical assessment of just how damaging surface ozone can be. On the right-hand side here, this study showed you some of the sources, some of the causes of this problem, and basically attributed much of these over India to sources from transport and from energy generation. But I'll come on to look at that very shortly. So substantial burden on human health. There's also substantial effects of ozone on vegetation. So the top left-hand corner up here, I'm showing you the surface of a leaf under a microscope, and you can see the pores in the leaf, the stomata, and that's what the plant uses to take in carbon dioxide. Processes going on in the leaf which lead to photosynthesis to the plant growing. Unfortunately, of course, the plant can also take in ozone, and ozone can then damage the cells of the plant, and basically reduce its growth. It can also attack the surface of the leaf as well. And this leads to ozone damages. So examples down below from damage to potato leaves on the left, and the example I think is spinach on the right. So this is where you've had leaves and plants exposed to higher levels of ozone. It causes damage. It prevents them growing as effectively as they can. That, of course, there's a climate impact for that because it reduces the carbon uptake from the atmosphere. But there's also an effect on crop productivity. Reduces the amount of the plant can grow, and the amount of crops it can produce. So from a human perspective, this is probably the most important. The crop damage globally from ozone is thought to be somewhere around perhaps 100 million tons every year. That's globally across all crops. Some crops like soybean and wheat are really quite sensitive. Other crops like maize and rice are less sensitive. And the assessments on the left here are looking at the relative yield loss in different parts of the world. Some countries more affected for one crop than another, but there's quite a degree of variety across the world, depending where these particular crops are grown. And again, there have been some nice studies looking at potential impacts on India, suggesting wheat loss of the region of about 3.5 million tons a year, somewhere perhaps overall about 9% of cereal crops lost. I think this is quite a good assessment. This is about roughly where I think these probably are. There's a lot of variability in these numbers. A lot of people have made much larger assessments. Some have made smaller assessments. It's really quite difficult to understand the impacts of ozone and how it affects crops. We know it does, but to gauge its magnitude is really very challenging. And there's a lot of plant science, plant physiology, and that we don't fully understand. So the role of ozone and its damage on plants again is an area of uncertainty that it will be a good challenge for young scientists to tackle. We know it is damaging, but understanding how damaging it is really quite difficult. I've summarised here the impacts of tropospheric ozone on health and plants. Here again is a summary of ozone processes in the atmosphere. Up in the stratosphere, it's really all quite simple. It's just about oxygen, photolysis, and forming ozone. Down in the troposphere, down here, there are lots of things going on. There's lots of emissions of precursors from natural sources, from urban sources, from agricultural sources, from oceanic sources. There's lots of chemistry going on that makes it quite difficult to follow all the processes. So it's quite a challenge to understand what's causing ozone to be a problem in any particular part of the world at any particular time. We can use models to assess that. So here are some kind of studies of a kind of assessment of fairly recent model studies of the amount of ozone in the troposphere, something like 330, 340 teragrams, so that's million tons in the atmosphere, so about 1/10 of the total amount of ozone in the atmosphere. About 500 teragrams every year comes from the stratosphere. Air from the stratosphere is exchanged across the tropopause. We get air coming down from higher in the atmosphere to lower in the atmosphere. We get air moving up from the troposphere into the stratosphere. So there's an exchange of air, and that brings ozone down into the troposphere. But the biggest source is actually photochemistry in the atmosphere, in the troposphere, which both creates ozone and also destroys it. And ozone itself is also destroyed by deposition at the surface of the Earth. We talked about the effect of ozone on plants. That process removes ozone from the atmosphere. So we have removal at the surface of the Earth. And trying to understand ozone in the atmosphere requires that we understand these different processes and how important they are in different places. So there's a lot of challenges, scientific challenges, associated with understanding tropospheric ozone budget. So some of my studies in the past have really been looking at the long-range transport of ozone from one place to another. We say that when ozone is formed, it has a lifetime of maybe 2 or 3 weeks in the lower atmosphere. So that gives it enough time to travel from one continent to another. So, for example, I've shown you at the bottom, ozone formed over North America can be transported across the Atlantic to affect air quality in Europe. And again, in Europe, it can affect East Asia, and East Asia can back round affect North America again. So following the westerly path of the west to east transport of air in mid-latitude regions around the globe. So tropospheric ozone is very much a global problem. Lots of processes going on here to form it and to remove it and transport it. But the net effect is that we do have a substantial contribution from ozone in any part of the world comes from upwind regions. So trying to assess this impact is quite it's quite challenging. As part of the big international effort, as part of the UN Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE's task force on hemispheric transport of air pollution, HTAP, there was a kind of assessment of how much effect each continent had on each other continent. And I've just shown you a few little snapshots here, show you the effect of the different sources. So we've isolated the effect of ozone and its sources in different parts of the world, one at a time. So for example, the top left-hand corner here is seeing North American sources. So clearly ozone is greatest over the source region itself, but there's also this transport downwind, again, in this case, from west to east. You see the same thing occurring for East Asia and for European sources, and again, for Southern Asian sources too. Now, the interesting thing for South Asia is that, of course, we're in the tropical regions. So for much of the year, we actually get transport from east to west rather than from west to east. And also there's some clear distinctions in this part of the world because we have strong convection occurring, particularly, of course, during the monsoon season. So we have a lot of lifting in the atmosphere. So ozone can reach higher up in the atmosphere where it has a longer lifetime and can be transported further. So actually, although the effects here in the little images we have here look like this perhaps slightly smaller impact from South Asia, on a global scale, for the same amount of precursor emissions, we have a bigger global impact from South Asia than we do from the mid-latitude sources. I actually have video versions of these graphics, which kind of show you the dynamical behaviour. You can see these. You can see the ozone moving around with the meteorological features, but I haven't linked them here to keep this presentation quite simple. If you turn our attention now to look at India, the Indian region in particular. So we talked about ozone coming in from outside the region. What about ozone formed over India itself, over Southern Asia? Here are some emissions of the precursors the principal precursors for ozone in the atmosphere. This is taken from an international data set of emissions called EDGAR HTAP, and it appears for 2010. Now, there are some weaknesses in this data, and I'm just showing you this as an example of the different sources of precursors for ozone, but there are newer and better emission inventories being developed all the time. We're getting a better understanding of the distribution of these precursor emissions. I want to illustrate really that for different major sources, transport, residential, domestic sources, industry, energy generation sources, the distributions around the country are quite different, but also the contributions to different precursors are different. So, for example, for transport, there's a lot of NOx, nitrogen oxides emitted, slightly less VOC and carbon monoxide. Whereas for residential industrial sources, we have quite a lot of carbon monoxide and VOC emitted. So when we're talking about tackling emissions from a particular source, that also means that we're having more effect on one or other of these pollutants than the others. You'll also notice that some of these pollutants are very uniformly distributed across the country. Some are much more localized. So for the energy, for example, here, we're just looking at individual power stations. So we have very intense emissions in one small place and nothing much in between. And again, for different species, we have a lack of understanding in some cases for exactly how localized things are. This is just anthropogenic emissions. We also have natural emissions as well. And there's a key major pollutant missing here, and that's a major source missing here, and that's from crop burning and from agricultural activities. That releases a lot of smoke and pollutants into the atmosphere. It's very important for PM, but it's also quite important for ozone in the atmosphere as well. If we look at what ozone looks like over India, there was a nice study published a few years ago by Xiao Lu who was working in Harvard University at the time. What I'm doing is just showing you here, what he's showing you is how different things vary over the course of the year, from January, February at the top, down to November, December at the bottom. And the different columns here, the first three are showing you meteorological features. So this is showing you the temperature, humidity, and then the cloud cover over India. And on the right-hand side, we're showing surface or near surface ozone from OMI, which is the ozone monitoring instrument. So this is a satellite measurement of ozone from a chemical model, the GeosChem model, which matches the satellite measurements very well. And on the far right, I'm showing you ozone production, how much activity, how much chemical production of ozone we have in the lower atmosphere over India. And what you see is there's a good connection between the net production and the temperature and humidity over on the left-hand side. In the pre-monsoon period, when it's very hot, it's very dry, there's not so much cloud cover, we get very rapid formation of ozone, and this is the period with the biggest ozone problems in India. As you come later in the year, you get to the monsoon period, a lot more cloud cover, a lot more humidity, precursors are washed out of the atmosphere, there's slower chemistry, and so ozone becomes much less of a problem. So basically, just a reminder that ozone production in the atmosphere is very tied to meteorological conditions. Depends very much on the weather conditions and the climate of a particular location. But basically, the period for ozone formation is strongest in the kind of March, April, May, June kind of pre-monsoon period over this part of the world. We do have some challenges in representing ozone over the Indian subregion. This is some studies, again, based on models that were contributing to the HTAP studies and also more recent studies, chemistry climate model into comparison. This is global model studies of surface ozone. I don't need to worry too much about the numbers here, but I wanted to show you that at a global scale, models tend to overestimate ozone over India. There's more, we think there should be more ozone than there actually is. If you're comparing with measurements here in these cities in black, the models all tend to overestimate it. this is a difficult place to represent ozone formation processes because of the very rapid chemistry, the hot conditions, and the high precursor emissions. We tend to overestimate in our models, but it presents a particular challenge to representing ozone over this region. Now, the big concern is what's happening to ozone at the surface. It's increasing with time. Measurements, these are mostly measurements I've shown you here over Europe. Measurements show a substantial increase in time up until about 2000 or so. And at that point over Europe, they kind of stop increasing. And actually, very recently, we've started to see decreases in ozone, which is quite promising. Other parts of the world, we still have increases in ozone. So some variation in what's happening in different parts of the world. A recent assessment of this, published a little bit earlier this year, is based on multiple model studies, but also assimilates surface observations of ozone around the world. The colour scale isn't very clear here, but you can just about make out that over North America and over Europe, ozone is starting to reduce. We're starting to reduce the levels of the surface ozone over parts of East Asia and Southern Asia and the Middle East. We're starting to see increases. So again, there's some threat here from increasing surface ozone associated with principally with human activities and with increasing industrialization, increasing emissions. What do we think is going to happen in future? Well, these are some assessments I made for the major continental regions. These are using emission scenarios based on the representative concentration pathways, the RCPs. These were the international scenarios for development that were introduced for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Their assessments of future climate change also included future pollutants and how they might change in future. And they range from a very clean condition, RCP 2.6, where we have lots of reductions in greenhouse gases and pollutants, up to an RCP 8.5, where we have a kind of business as usual, lots of industrial production, lots of economic expansion, and increased greenhouse gas emissions. So you see there's a span in the effects of ozone. In North America and Europe, ozone is generally reducing across all of these scenarios, although of course it reduces much more for the cleaner scenarios. Over South Asia and East Asia, we see a much more varied effect. In South Asia, we have quite a lot of increase of ozone expected in the near future. And if you look at the ozone changes along this kind of severe scenario, in the bottom right-hand corner, I've shown you the distribution of the ozone changes by 2030. So this is between 2000 and 2030. We see substantial ozone changes, increases over India and China and South Asia and East Asia, decreases over North America and Europe. And this is quite close to what we've seen happening between 2000 and 2020 in reality. If we take another more detailed look at what might happen at the surface, these are some studies done by Stephen Turnock looking at results from the models that are coming, the CMIP models that are contributing to the very latest IPCC climate report. That's the AR6 report that's published this year. These assessments are basically looking at ozone in different parts of the world on a variety of different scenarios. These are newer scenarios, SSP scenarios. Again, there are cleaner ones in blue here, and there are more business as usual ones in red. And if you look across the different world regions here, one thing that does attract your eye is that we have substantial increases over South Asia, up to perhaps 15 parts per billion of ozone over this region in the more severe scenarios. So there's very much a threat to this region if economic activity, industrial activity continues as it does at the present time. I don't want to be too pessimistic here. Let's take another look at it. If you look at the cleaner scenarios here, you see very substantial decreases in ozone over South Asia. So I think that's giving us a very positive message that there is a lot of opportunity for reducing surface ozone in this part of the world if we follow these cleaner scenarios. So we have quite a substantial drop in ozone, maybe bigger than most other regions, in fact. So there's lots of opportunity for reducing ozone in this particular part of the world. So that's at a regional scale. I wanted to kind of finish off by thinking what's happening at a more local scale, some urban conditions. So I'll show you some results from a recent study that we've been involved with. It's a big study, joint UK-India study focusing on air pollution and human health. It's focusing on cities. We've chosen Delhi for this particular study, but many of the same aspects apply to other cities across India. So we're focusing on a whole variety of things, from emissions, looking at the understanding the processes going on that control air quality in this city, in human exposure, and for thinking about how we might go about improving the conditions. So again, this is funded by the NERC, Natural Environment Research Council in the UK, and also by the Ministry of Earth Sciences in India, and a number of other important agencies that we've mentioned at the bottom here too. This study has 5 separate programs. I'm not going to describe the details here, but some of them focus on the emissions, some of them focus on the processes, some of them are on health, and one at the end time is focusing on mitigation approaches. And I just wanted to emphasise that there's a lot of institutes involved, a lot of good scientists from across both the UK and Indian institutions who've been contributing to this programme. It's still ongoing. We haven't finished yet, but I just wanted to show you a few of the studies from it from our perspective, thinking about ozone in cities. So I've been contributing to the Promote project, which is really understanding some of the processes that control air air quality in Delhi. And so we're bringing in a variety of different scales. I've showed you the figures on the right-hand side there, looking at satellite images of nitrogen oxides, showing you the hotspots of where the highest concentrations are. We've been looking at crop burning over parts of northern India and its impact on particulate matter. And we've also been looking down at very small scales, at street scales, with a local street model to look at the impact of traffic sources on pollutants in Delhi. So there's been a number of observational campaigns and then a major modelling effect to try to understand the processes which control pollution in the city and how we might go about improving it, mitigating it. So our studies have been using regional models to look at India and to focus zoom in down to Delhi at high resolution. And what we've been using the SAFAR emission inventory for Delhi, so much higher resolution than available from global sources. And we've been trying to explore the sensitivity of the pollution there to the different emissions from different sectors. I won't go into the details there, but we're looking at how the different source sectors affect pollutant levels. And what we've done is we looked at the main 4 sources. We looked at domestic sources, at traffic, at power and industry together, and at sources outside the city. So there's 4 separate categories of sources we're looking at, and we're focusing both on PM and ozone here. And by varying the emissions from these different sources, we can see how much they contribute to the total variation in pollutant levels in the city. So basically, what we don't derive from this is that for particulate matter in Delhi, we're dominated by sources occurring outside the city, particularly then also from traffic sources during rush hour. But for ozone, we're dominated very much during the daytime by ozone from outside the city, and during the nighttime we're affected strongly by traffic sources in the city itself. So this gives us some ideas, some useful ways of approaching understanding how we might improve the air quality. If we're looking at ozone, we're finding that much of the ozone in Delhi is actually coming from outside it, from the national capital region, and therefore we have to apply, if we're doing emission controls, we need to apply them from a wider area, not just over the city itself. So one way of summarising this is to draw these little diagrams here, these little kind of response surfaces. So what we're looking at here on the x-axis, you have the emissions from the national capital region around Delhi. And on the y-axis, we have the emissions from traffic sources in Delhi. And we're looking at what happens if you control those. So we are currently at the star point where we have 100% of the current emissions in both cases. How do we reduce the emissions to improve the air quality? And most of the current mitigation approaches focus on traffic and residential energy use. Okay, and that means that we're following the white arrow across that response surface. We're reducing the traffic emissions, but we're not changing what's happening outside the region, outside the city. And when we do that, we go into the blue here, we reduce the particulate matter, but we actually end up increasing the ozone. So just focusing on those sources alone will give us better air quality for PM, but worse air quality for ozone. So in order to solve that problem, we need to reduce the regional emissions at the same time. Okay, so if we follow the pink arrow rather than the white arrow, we reduce the traffic emissions from Delhi, but we also reduce emissions outside the region of Delhi, then we can actually get a greater reduction in PM without any increase in ozone. So it's kind of emphasizing that often urban pollution, for any of these pollutants, is not just an urban issue. It's also caused by what's happened around about the city. So finally, a reminder of the difficulties with controlling urban ozone in cities. And that's that ozone production is non-linear. As you increase the amount of nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere, you actually decrease the production of ozone. And ultimately, if you keep on increasing nitrogen oxides, then destruction starts to win out over production. And we start to get a decrease in the amount of production. And that's what I'm showing at the bottom here. As we increase the amount of NOx, production increases, but we get a certain amount of turnover at some point. And that's often shown in this isoplex diagram on the right-hand side. What we're looking at on this diagram is the concentration of ozone, which is low at the bottom here and is high up in the right-hand corner. And this is based on the amount of hydrocarbons, the amount of VOC, and the amount of nitrogen oxides. So where we are on this diagram tells us what will happen to ozone if we reduce or increase the emissions of NOx or hydrocarbons. And we often describe the environment in different parts of the surface as NOx limited or VOC limited. And what this means, if in the NOx limited region here, is if we change the amount of NOx, so we go up and down this scale, then we can increase or decrease ozone. So if we reduce NOx, we can reduce ozone. But changes in hydrocarbon emissions, VOC emissions, have little effect. If we're in the VOC limited region, then if we reduce NOx, we actually end up increasing ozone. If we reduce VOC, we reduce ozone. So this gives us the slightly counterintuitive problem. If we're reducing NOx, we can actually make ozone worse. This is one of the challenges that are faced in many cities around the world at the current time. So how can we control ozone in a big city in India? One of our little studies here was to use a chemical box model, and we fit it with some observations. So this is the black lines here, the observations on the left-hand side from June, on the right-hand side from November, different times of year. And we've used these to calibrate a model, and then we've used our model to understand the sensitivity to different emissions. So again, this is a nice use of models forced and constrained by observations to understand the processes going on in the atmosphere. And what I'm showing you here is this isoplex diagram again. So blue is low ozone, red is high ozone. And what we're looking at in the top row here is what happens if we increase or decrease the emissions of VOC and the emissions of NOx. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you the measurements from June, and the data from June, and the right-hand side, it's in the November period. First of all, there's an opportunity to get higher ozone in November, in this case, than there is in June. If you look at the lower side down here, we're looking at the effect of aerosol. So Unfortunately, if we're looking at aerosol also, we try to reduce the amount of particulate matter in the atmosphere. That lets more light through. And if there's more light, then the chemistry is a little bit faster. If the chemistry is faster, we get more ozone formation. So what that means is if we target our urban air pollution, our control, our mitigation of policies on reducing particles, it means we might get more ozone because we have faster production. So this is really emphasizing that there's several different things to control, not just NOx and VOC, but we also need to look at particulate matter at the same time. And what we're seeing, interestingly, is if you reduce particulate matter, you see not very much effect in June, in pre-monsoon period, but in November, there's a substantial effect. If you reduce the PM, we can get substantially more ozone formed. And there's generally higher levels of NOx at this time of year. So one of our contributions was to create a three-dimensional isopleth plot for Delhi here. This shows you what happens if you control NOx emissions, VOC emissions, and particulate matter. And basically, the star is where we are at the moment. We can move across this space depending what we do with our controls. But in summary, ozone production in Delhi is VOC limited. We're dependent on the amount of these volatile organic compounds and hydrocarbons, and the limitation is stronger in wintertime. And also, ozone production is limited by the amount of sunlight in winter as well. So in fact, it becomes even more important to control VOC in winter than it is in the pre-monsoon period. So kind of in summary, from an urban perspective, what we're learning from this, it applies to Delhi, but also applies to many other cities around the world. Reducing VOC is really the key to avoiding high emissions. We want to reduce NOx and particles as well, of course, but VOC is really very important. And often that's not high on the agenda for many policymakers. So let me finish with some concluding thoughts. I've described to ozone at a tropospheric scale, how it's a global pollutant, and how different regions of the world can affect each other. We've talked a bit about how surface ozone is increased in many parts of the world, but also that it's decreasing in some regions. Surface ozone can be controlled. There's a positive message there. Looking at North America and Europe, ozone is now dropping. And it'd be good to see that around other parts of the world as well, with benefits for health and of course for agricultural yields. Regional ozone does remain a substantial challenge for India. Clearly, there are large impacts on health and crops at the moment, which would be good if we could reduce. And there are substantial increases projected over Southern Asia if policies continue as they are at present. So there really is a substantial challenge here, but it can be mitigated with the right air quality policies. And finally, I thought about ozone. Ozone in India in particular, policies that focus just on particles will often end up increasing peak ozone. That's a challenge. If we want to control ozone, you need to look not just at the local, regional, urban sources, but also at the wider regions around about to control both particles and ozone. And ultimately, to controlling ozone in urban regions, controlling sources of VOC is really the key. Sources of solvents and paints and release of hydrocarbons from incomplete combustion, lots of sources. These are the things that need to be reduced to avoid high urban ozone. So hopefully that's given you an overview of some of the challenges associated with ozone in the lower atmosphere, and also some thoughts about how we might go about reducing it in the future. I hope you found that interesting, and thanks very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, sir, for such an enlightening and informative talk. We had only basic knowledge about ozone layer, but after your in-depth talk, we have gained insight on surface ozone and its environmental impacts. Our attendees definitely will gain much from your talk. Now, we will have few questions from the online viewers. First, our viewer is asking, Navya and Prashant Shokin is asking, what is null cycle?
So the null cycle is when you have nitrogen oxides, you have NO2, that when it photolyzes to NO, it creates an oxygen atom, but when NO reacts with ozone, that removes an ozone back to NO2. So you get an ozone formed and an ozone removed. And the net effect of that cycle is no change in ozone. So every time you take NO2 to NO, you get one ozone formed. And every time you take NO to NO2, you get one ozone removed. But if we have peroxy radicals around, the removal is less efficient, and so we have net production. So I didn't want to drown you with the chemistry, and I apologise for coming from a chemistry background. In natural environments, you don't get very much ozone from nitrogen cycling, but when we have lots of methane and hydrocarbons around, then that cycling becomes effective for creating ozone.
Okay. Another viewer is asking, Aniket Gode is asking, can we make ozone in labs and release in atmosphere? Also is asking, what is the second option for ozone gas?
So, I mean, we do create ozone in the labs, of course, for I mean, as I say, coming from a chemical background, there are many chemical experiments done with ozone. We have to create it if we want to use it for doing studies. We wouldn't want to create it on a large scale. It would be interesting to think about how we could remove ozone from the atmosphere on a large scale, but it's challenging because it's affected by so many other things. Because we don't actually emit ozone in the atmosphere. It's created there and destroyed there by other things. It becomes quite difficult to control. If we want to control particles in the atmosphere, we just reduce the emissions of particles. That's much easier. But for ozone, we can't. It's very difficult to control it because we control it indirectly. So that makes it more difficult to get to. Was that the whole question, or was something I missed something?
What is the second option for ozone gas?
Second option for what? Sorry, that's
ozone gas. For ozone gas.
I'm not quite sure what that's referring to. The second option.
I think we were very curious about ozone gas, and also that's why they're asking actually what is the second option for ozone gas. Okay.
I think the viewer is asking a question like, what if we cannot produce ozone, but naturally which other gas can act as a ozone?
Well, I mean, it's formed there naturally, so we're not actually releasing it. So the problem is actually, I mean, it's naturally there, but it's climbing to higher levels than we would like because of our activities and trying to reduce the effect of it. I'm saying it's naturally very beneficial in the stratosphere, but down near the surface, where we live, it's very damaging. So again, it's difficult to know how to address it.
Thank you, sir. Another viewer is asking, Kaif Khan is asking, why has an ozone hole appeared over Antarctica when ozone depleting substances are present throughout the stratosphere?
Yeah, well, that's the effect of some of the properties of the stratosphere. When we release chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, they're very, very stable. They're very unreactive in the troposphere. But when they get up into the stratosphere, the radiation is strong enough to cause them to break up. So they get chlorine is released. And the reason why the ozone hole appears over Antarctica is because it's much colder in the stratosphere, in the lower stratosphere over Antarctica. When it gets below about 195 Kelvin, that's minus 80 degrees centigrade, you get particles formed there. You get clouds, polar stratospheric clouds. And when you have those clouds, they help the chlorine destroy ozone. So the ozone hole appears where the very cold temperatures are. That's over the Antarctic, a little bit over the Arctic too, but mostly over the Antarctic. So that's why it appears there, and also why nothing happens in the troposphere, because the troposphere is not cold enough and because CFCs are very stable.
Thank you, sir. The last question is Abhishek Kumar is asking, what is the relationship between stratosphere cloud and ozone concentration?
So again, that's to do with when you get clouds in the stratosphere. You only get clouds in the stratosphere when it's very, very cold. And that provides a surface for the chemistry the chemistry that is involved in stratospheric ozone destruction to occur. When the temperatures is warmer, the clouds don't appear, and then you don't get the destruction. So that's really about where the clouds are, where the clouds form, the very, very cold temperatures. So if we reduce the amount of CFCs, the clouds will still form, but you won't have the chlorine released from the CFCs, and so that will allow the ozone hole gradually to recover.
Thank you, sir. Due to lack of time, we cannot take all questions now. But if you have any questions, mail us on iitm-envi@nic.in, which will be conveyed to our Professor Oliver. Thank you once again, Professor, for being our chief guest for World Ozone Day 2021. Now, we will move to second part of the event, for which all participants are eagerly waiting, that is online quiz competition. All of you, I'm just giving a gentle reminder that registration is compulsory for quiz. If you are still not registered, then first register and attend the quiz. The link for the quiz will get activated in next 5 minutes. Till then, I request Ms. Darshana to take this opportunity to showcase our gratitude towards our guests and viewers. Ms. Darshana.
I would like to thank our chief guest, Professor Oliver Wilde, for giving such an interesting and thoughtful talk. I hope we will have more awareness events with you. Thank you. To all our viewers and participants, especially school and college teachers who insisted their students to participate. Then I sincerely thank the Director of IITM for giving us all necessary permissions. I also thank our computer division and IT support. Thank you all. I sincerely appreciate your attention and interest in today's event. Now I conclude this session. Stay safe, stay curious. Have a good evening, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Oliver, for accepting our invitation. We'll look forward to you for any other event which we may request you again to give a talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It was very nice to have the opportunity to speak about these things and hopefully to help inform more people about the challenges and solutions that face the atmospheric perspective in your part of the world. I think it's a very interesting place, and I think there's a lot of interesting science still to be done to understand the processes and to help improve the air quality in the region.
Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed for inviting me. So it was very much appreciated to have the opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.